Is there a secret to writing recipes that accurately reflect all the realities of cooking at home? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Molly Stevens, and today I am here with my co-host, Kate Leahy. Hey, Kate.
Hey, Molly.
Let's talk about recipes a little bit, because we write recipes for a living, or somewhat of a living. But there's some challenges in writing recipes that I sometimes feel like we're faking it. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It doesn't really reflect what really goes on behind getting something on the table.
Right. It doesn't take into account the 2 hours round trip that you spent maybe going grocery shopping.
Going to multiple markets because you can't find something.
Right. And then you get home and you got to schlep everything into the kitchen, and then you got to put it away or put it somewhere. And then you got to wash all that produce or season things and marinate things. There's a lot of time that I don't think we account for when we talk about cooking. And I feel like that's why a lot of people who cook at home can get overwhelmed really easily. I know I do. And I feel like sometimes, am I a fraud? Because I feel like I don't always have fun in the kitchen.
Right. There's that too. And I think of myself as someone who teaches people to cook. And I think back to some of my early writing, and I was just writing recipes without really thinking about all that was going into it or would have to go into it to get that meal or on the table or that pie in the oven or afterwards to cleaning up. So I don't know, it's a tricky business. And I think some authors, we're seeing more and more people talk about it. And today we have Bea Wilson on, who has written a new cookbook, The Secret of Cooking: Recipes for an Easier Life in the Kitchen. And she really takes this topic head on.
Right. This isn't just, cooking is difficult, but here's some easy tricks up my sleeve. This is sort of, you go into the full stories, and she does not shy away from talking about dishes, talking about just when you're too tired to be bothered to cook.
Right. Yet the book is still filled with lots of joy and deliciousness. Yes. So I'm really excited to talk to Bea. Bea Wilson is a UK-based cook, food writer, and journalist. You may have seen her byline in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, The London Review of Books. She's written 7 narrative nonfiction books before this cookbook, and we really can't wait to talk to her and hear how she put this book together. Well, Bea Wilson, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're really excited to talk to you, and I think we have a lot we want to ask. But first of all, congratulations on your new cookbook, The Secret of Cooking. Just a gorgeous book, and we have so much to ask you about it. But if we could go in the Wayback Machine for a little bit, talk to how you sort of got here. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think you have a doctorate degree from Cambridge, and you started your professional life as an academic?
Yes, and it was nothing to do with food, really. I had a kind of first tiny career. It's so long ago now, it's hard even to think of. But I was studying history of ideas, history of French political thought. But we kind of, if we're talking about the cookbook, I like your phrase, way back. We need to go way, way, way back. Because I really kind of wanted to write a cookbook since I was about 8.
Wow.
So in a way, maybe the academic career was the detour, and maybe all of the other books I've done were the detour, and I just needed to reach this point. But yes, you're right. I did have a first career, and I did do food writing alongside my PhD. I was very lucky that I got my first food column in the UK for a small political magazine called The New Statesman when I was in my early 20s. But I always thought of it as my hobby. It was just something that I did alongside the day job. And then at a certain point, I had my oldest son when I was quite young, and bedtime and bath time and things like that kind of clashed with the seminars that I should have been organising. And it was a sort of crunch point where I could have gone to the next rung of the academic ladder. And then I thought, this food writing is really fun. And I can just do it after the baby's gone to sleep, if he ever went to sleep. That one didn't sleep very much. And it just seemed this great thing that I sort of fell into. I never felt like I actually had the ambition to be a food writer. It seems like too wonderful a thing to be. I don't know how you feel about it, but getting to write about food and sometimes be paid for it. It's the dream.
Yeah.
Right.
There's someone who says that when you call yourself a food writer, you're underselling. And this, especially in terms of your first 7 books, which were, focused on history and health and psychology and were not what a lot of food writers think of.
Right.
Exactly. I remember for years and years, I'd have these conversations where I'd meet someone at a party and they'd ask what I did, and I'd say food writer, and they'd always say recipes or restaurants. And I would say, well, actually, kind of neither.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They would look so blank, like, what's left? What else is there? And I think that has changed. I do think, I don't know how you feel, but that food writing people's perception of it has opened up. There's more of an interest in food history. There's more of a sense of doing it in political ways, in cultural ways, and that can only be a good thing. But it's sort of funny, like finally I came around to recipes, and then it's been such a challenging, fascinating, wonderful process. And I realize when people almost say just recipes, they're such a difficult thing to do as well. And a recipe is not just a recipe, is it? It's so many decisions go into how you do it.
Right. And there's so many decisions that you put into this book to make your recipes. I mean, they're really, like Molly and I were talking about just how different they are. But first I have to ask, do you remember what your cookbook you wanted to write when you were 8 years old? What was it?
I don't think I had a subject in mind. I cooked from such a young age, and my mother was so kind and let me kind of go in her kitchen and waste ingredients, and just kind of, mainly I just remember melting butter and kind of stirring tomatoes in it and seeing how that would taste. And in a way, that's still how I cook. But the big thing that I have this strong memory of, there's a food writer who was very popular in Britain when I was growing up. I don't know if her books were ever published in the States. I think she was from New Zealand originally, but she was called Bee, and my name is Bee, whereas most Bees I ever meet are called Bea.
Mm-hmm.
But I was christened Beatrice. And she was called Bee Nilsson, which I presume is a Scandinavian name. But I remember taking a pen and changing the N to a W. So I think I just wanted to have been Bee Nilsson, who was the author of the Penguin Cookery book. I mean, and I look back at that book and I think I wouldn't want to write it at all. It was very kind of plain food of the kind that was popular in Britain. I think it was first published in the 50s, but it was just a sort of compendium. So I don't really know what my vision was exactly, except it just seemed like such an exciting thing to do.
So there's my mind is racing. I think on one hand we could just dive into this conversation about how food writing is considered a domestic occupation and all the pitfalls of that. But we do want to talk about the secret of cooking, which is not the secrets of cooking, and is something is interesting to me as well. But so you've had this idea since you were 8 to write a cookbook, but clearly went in a different direction. But how, after writing these 7 books without recipes, how do you then say, okay, now I'm going to do a cookbook proper?
Out of those 7 books, one of them was a book, a tiny book called This Is Not a Diet Book, which did have some recipes in it. And what that partly was, so as I say, I've had the ambition to do it for all of these years. The editor that I've worked with in the UK on my past few books is someone called Louise Haynes, who is just a brilliant, legendary cookbook editor. I think we started with First Bite, and then I did The Way We Eat Now with her. And then I did this little one, This Is Not a Diet Book, and that was partly Louise testing me out to see if I could write recipes. And after I did that little book, she said, yes, I like how you do recipes. And I had many other ideas for other narrative, non-fiction, non-recipe books. But I kind of thought, well, it's almost a waste to be working with this wonderful editor and not make now the moment that I finally do my cookbook. And that's a sort of strange pragmatic reason for doing it in a way. But the more kind of personal reasons were, in a way, the idea for the book had been percolating away in the back of my mind for years and years, in that I've always loved to cook, as I say. Years ago, in my 20s, part of how I got into food writing, I went on a TV show called MasterChef, very high stakes, competitive cooking of a kind I never do now. But that shows that I am someone who's been cooking on a daily basis for a long time. And I would describe it as my passion. But I kind of realized, to my shock and surprise, that by the time I had 3 kids and I was juggling that with work, that cooking wasn't always a joy. And I talked to other friends at the school gates or people I knew through work, and so many people would say, oh, just cooking's a bit of a grind, or they say, I hate the shopping. If only someone else could do the shopping for me, then I'd enjoy the cooking.
Or the washing up.
Or the washing up, exactly.
Right.
So I had this idea, which is what became The Secret of Cooking, at the back of my mind for more than 10 years now, of if only I could just write a book that would bring the deliciousness of it back, the joy of it back, for those of us, which is actually everyone who is trying to combine cooking with the rest of what life has to throw at us. And I didn't quite know how to do that. Then when I just sat down and wrote the proposal for Louise, suddenly, usually I'm really bad at thinking up book titles. They usually come to me really, really late on. With this one, I was thinking and thinking, and suddenly the phrase, The Secret of Cooking, came to me. And I began searching library catalogues and Googling it and thinking, surely someone has called a book that before. And then when I discovered that they hadn't, I just thought, well, I have to call it that. But I don't know what The Secret of Cooking is. And you're right. It went to and fro whether it should have been Secrets of Cooking, because obviously there isn't one secret of cooking. But then I thought of the second half of the sentence, which I do think is universally true, or at least maybe you can think of a counterexample. I haven't thought of one yet, which is, regardless of what kind of cooking you're doing, the secret of cooking is always the person who cooks. And as soon as I had that concept, I thought, okay, I can write this book. And this is a book which I wanted to write, a book that would have been helpful for me 10 years earlier or at various stages of family life. I hope it has been.
I think one of the reasons this book really resonated with me is that, and Molly, I don't want to speak for you, but it's sort of like when you are in a situation where cooking becomes sort of your job, your work, you're generating, new ideas, you're maybe testing recipes, you're writing about food, and then you actually have to cook and feed yourself and feed your family and friends. And all of a sudden, it's not always that fun. And then you start feeling, am I a fraud because I'm doing all this work in food? And then I read your book and it's okay to love food, but then not always love actually food in a way. Like you love it, but it's so you kind of give us permission to question, why is it so hard? And why don't we ever acknowledge how hard it is to put food on the table and how it's not always a joy? So how did you come up with the structure? It's such an unusual structure for a cookbook.
Thank you. In a way, yeah, the structure is almost more, I don't know whether to use the phrase self-help, but it's almost more like a self-help book in a way, in that it's very thematic. It's not structured into desserts and soups and entrees. It's things like what no one tells you about cooking, or reduce your options, the sweetness of routine, or the very first chapter, which I really do. This is my kitchen philosophy, cut yourself some slack, which is trying to be cooking for those times when you are flat out exhausted. It's not that you want those simplified recipes all the time. It includes things like, I'm not the first person to do this, but that magic pasta where you, instead of boiling the pasta separately and making the sauce, you just put everything in the pan together. I have a mushroom one that I invented for myself after my ex-husband left, which happened very early on in the process of writing the book, which is another part of the story of it. And I wanted to make myself something really delicious that kind of felt like a treat and almost felt like the kind of mushroom pasta you might get in a restaurant with wine and cream and parsley, but as easy as if someone else has cooked it for me. So it's not that you always will want to have magic pasta. My youngest son now refers to muggle pasta because he thinks if that's magic pasta, then there must be muggle pasta the other way because of Harry Potter. And I know what he means, that it's you need different cooking for different occasions. So you're asking, how did I come up with the structure? I realized the biggest thing that I wanted to talk about in the book was this idea of needing different kinds of cooking for different occasions. That the kind of recipes you need when you're feasting, so the final chapter is called Fiesta, and this is like when you're having people around and you want to be expansive and you maybe want to spend hours in the kitchen. These are the kind of things you might make. Is this famous phrase, life's too short to stuff a vegetable. One of the feasts is a whole array of 3 different kinds of stuffed vegetables. They actually don't take that long. But it's not the kind of thing that you're necessarily going to whip up on a rainy Tuesday evening when you're feeling overloaded. And there's a chapter about cooking alone, which is one of the ones that I really, really enjoyed testing and creating, partly because, as I say, my ex-husband left quite unexpectedly in the middle of the project. And at the time, I thought, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And then now I look back on the book and I think, the book could never have happened in this way if he hadn't left. It taught me so many things about cooking, about myself, about how cooking can really make you feel. And sometimes it can be the most amazing thing to hold on to when you really don't feel very certain about anything.
Mm-hmm.
That cooking for one chapter, would that have happened had your husband not left?
The cooking alone concept was always part of what I planned to explore, but it really expanded, and he gave me the chance, admittedly, it didn't feel so welcome at the time, but he gave me the chance to really test it in a really authentic way and in real time, and with a kind of stab of sadness in my heart, because it wasn't just I was cooking alone, but I think any divorced parent can relate to this, that moment at which your kids are going off for the first time to have dinner in a different place with the other parent, and suddenly your kitchen table is just full of absence. What is the food that you can cook for yourself under those circumstances that is going to feel like a treat without taking you all evening to make and wash up?
Mm-hmm.
So there was something very real and raw about the process of creating those dishes. So I had intended to do a cooking alone section, but had he not left, my main experience of cooking alone would have been just, I guess, making working lunches for myself, which is something I have done plenty of cooking alone over the years in a different way, but I feel I lived it much more fully.
Clearly through your work, you're a voracious reader, researcher. You have such a facility with cookbooks, with the genre, historical references. We're curious, do you have a list of pet peeves and things that other cookbooks get wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I'm sure both of you know firsthand from your amazing work, it's a very humbling process writing a recipe, let alone a cookbook, isn't it? Because you set off thinking, okay, I'm going to crack the formula. I'm going to be able to do this in a really easy, really foolproof way.
Right.
And then you discover you can't. A bit like I'm saying the secret of cooking is the person who cooks.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do it in a way that will please everyone. At various stages in the book, I quote someone called John Lanchester, who's a brilliant novelist, but he's also written about food. And I cite this conversation. There's a section I have called something like All Recipes Are Incomplete. And he talks about the fact that a recipe can only ever be the scaffolding, not the whole building, which I thought was a brilliant concept. And he talks about the fact that when he was learning to cook for the first time through cookbooks, this is obviously pre-YouTube, where he could have looked this up and seen how to do it. But he said he just came across the word fold, and he simply straightforwardly didn't know what that word meant. He only knew fold as in folding paper, but how could that be applying to this mixture he had in front of him in a bowl? And he was saying to me, all recipes, no matter how beautifully or perfectly or thoughtfully constructed, and as we know, not all of them are, have these sudden moments of incomprehension. And in answer to your question about the pet peeves, I think there are sloppy recipes, aren't there? There are ones which are sort of not perfectly copy edited. It's annoyed me over the years. I think I give an example of sort of someone, you have a fish recipe and they tell you to chop some onions, and you get to the end of the recipe and you realize they never told you what to do with the onions. So you've got some fish over here and some raw onions sitting on a chopping board over there. And that's obviously a little bit annoying. But that's just a sort of little error, really, isn't it? That's not something unique to a cookbook. That happens in all books. The difference, I suppose, with a cookbook, which I strongly felt the sense of responsibility of it, which on the one hand, there is no feeling I have ever had as a writer as magical as when someone actually makes something from the book and tells you they loved it and that they made it again and their kids asked for it, or that they were worrying what to make when they had people around for dinner and this was just glorious. And there's nothing, I've had lots of people very generously tell me that they liked my words or that they enjoyed this or that section of a book I've written or they learnt something. But to think you could actually put a good taste in someone's mouth, that's so wonderful. But then the flip side of that is you could spoil someone's dinner.
It's a huge responsibility.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And you really don't want them to be ending up in that place. So I don't think there's a perfect way around it. One of the answers I came up with, this is hardly original to me, is that you can have exact measurements and then you have sensory descriptions. And for me, a good recipe should ideally always have both. And again, I talk about this a bit, that if you just are cooking for the clock, well, ovens vary. Even somebody's sense of what a medium-high heat might be with a gas stove is not something that you can absolutely universally predict. But it's, I think, well, you're kind of entering into a contract with the reader, and you hope that kind of on both sides there's going to be forgiveness. But as the recipe writer, you are absolutely doing your darndest to make sure that, as far as possible, those little moments of incomprehension, that you've maybe predicted what at least some of them are going to be. But I found it, I mean, it was a funny process testing this book as well, because I was doing most of the writing in 2020 and then finishing it in 2021. And that was the pandemic, and we had the endless lockdowns. So my main focus group of testers was my younger son and my daughter. I would also get my daughter actually to try out some of the recipes for me. And I realized, even when you're as intimate with someone as living under the same roof, someone you've known all of their life, she didn't understand some of the things I'd said. I'd write brown or golden brown. And to her, she's currently studying art at university, her idea of brown was like this pale, pale beige. And I was like, Tash, that's not brown. That's not what I call brown. I was thinking of dark chestnutty brown. And I realized that in response to things that she would tell me, I would make these little adjustments. But you ultimately know you can never write the perfect recipe. But what I wanted to do in the book was, I see it almost as a kind of meta cookbook, in that I was trying to write a book that would keep people company in the kitchen and help them make sense of not just my recipes, but all of their other cookbooks.
That's very well said. And you do build in, I mean, in your recipe, you have a couple different recipe formats, and we might talk about that a little bit, but I notice you mix in quite a lot of, so mix in the curry powder and notice the fragrance that suddenly fills the room. Or with the asparagus, you're not aiming for grass green crunch, but sage green softness. So you try to really get those more descriptive. So you're not just relying on saute until brown, some of what we often refer to as recipe speak. There's not a lot of that in here. And you also say very upfront is that everything is optional, even the recipe.
Everything's optional. Even the decision whether to cook or order in takeout is optional. I'm so glad you gave those examples, because actually the more I went on, the more I think, other than certain things, like with salt, if I were to write another cookbook, which I am planning to do, I think I would probably do universal quantities in teaspoons of fine salt. In this book, I did that for almost every recipe, but sometimes I would say add a pinch of salt or season to taste. And now I've come round to the thinking, actually, seasoning something so crucial, and it makes such a difference to a finished dish, that unless someone's on a low salt diet, in which case they'll ignore you anyway, it's really helpful to do salt to the gram or to the teaspoon. But with other things, I began by saying something like the difference between grass green and sage green is almost poetic, whereas what people need is to know exactly 10 minutes. And I now think grass green is something really precise and helpful, because you can kind of, what the reader's doing, I hope, when they read that, is they're learning how to use their own eyes and their own nose when I'm talking about the fragrance of the curry powder. And what I'm hoping is that then the next time they cook it, they're going to have the confidence to realize they can do it by themselves.
You're trying to get them to pay attention.
Yeah. And actually, I think there's a bit where I say seasoning is mostly about noticing. But I actually think cooking is really mostly about noticing and learning to trust yourself, which can be a really difficult thing to do. I absolutely include myself here too. It used to be when I'd have people around, I was endlessly second guessing if something was good enough. But I firmly believe that the more you learn what your senses are teaching you, and you learn to trust it, and you learn what you like, then that's part of how you kind of crawl your way back to cooking being a daily joy rather than something annoying.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Everything Cookbooks, but it does take resources to make it happen, and we'd like to invite you, our loyal listeners, to help us keep the lights on. To support the show, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There you can find links to any upcoming insider events where we go even further behind the scenes of our cookbook publishing world. You can also leave us a review, order books through our affiliate page, check out our t-shirts and sweatshirts and other merch, or buy us a round of coffee. Every little bit of support really helps the show keep going. Thanks for listening.
We've talked a little bit about the structure, but just to lay it out, the chapter called Cut Yourself Some Slack, you follow that with Take the Easy Way Out. And then you have a section called Have a Backup Plan. And then you have a section called Teach Yourself to Cook with a Carrot. Molly and I just love this cook with a carrot thing. Let's just talk about the carrot. You know, you have 8 recipes and you have a full range of things to do with a carrot. Why carrots? Where did this idea come from?
I'm so glad you like this section because I was kind of going to and fro on it and thinking, is this going to seem a bit crazy?
It could be a whole book.
It could be a whole book. Consider the carrots, right?
And plus, I remember, Kate and I were talking about this, I remember trying to describe roll cut in one passage once, and I'm not sure if I gave up or if I did it, but when I read yours, I was like, done, she's just done it.
Oh, you're so kind, because I thought I haven't really it's really show, don't tell, isn't it? Like so much cooking, and that's why writing a cookbook is a slightly artificial thing. Yeah, so the idea of Teach Yourself to Cook with a Carrot is I'm trying to talk about the fact that for so many people, what's daunting about cooking, and all of us are in this position to some degree because there may be some skill we're very confident in and other forms of cooking that just terrifies us. It's because we haven't done it. And so the way to become a really good, really confident cook is to do it a bunch of times, fail, and then do it again. But no one wants to do the failing part because you end up with a horrible dinner. So my thought was that if you could start with something really inexpensive, really accessible, generally loved, such as a bag of carrots, that you could teach yourself a whole range of knife skills and different cooking techniques that you can then either just to apply to carrots if you love carrots, or you learn how to roast a carrot, then you can roast a chicken. You learn how to roll cut a carrot, you could roll cut any vegetable. The idea is, as I say in the book, is far from original to me. And actually, it's strangely in 2019, no fewer than 2 delightful short cookbooks came out more or less with this concept. One of them was Organic Carrot Cookbook by a wonderful British food blogger called Kirsten Rogers, who goes by the name Ms. Marmite Lover. And the second was 50 Ways to Cook a Carrot by someone called Peter Hertzman, who's an American food writer. He's probably better known. He wrote a really great book about knives called Knife Skills Illustrated.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, my thought was just that if you could go from everything from a grated carrot salad, for which my favourite variant is one with Burmese flavourings of mint and peanuts and fish sauce, to this recipe, which is one of my favourites in the whole book, even though it's incredibly simple, Raymond's Butter Poached Carrots, which is just, if you are one of those, let's say more old-fashioned cooks or eaters who loves the idea of just a simple side of simple vegetables, but you don't want to do the thing of steaming it and then tossing it in butter, there's this way, if you can get the ratio and proportions and timing exactly right, you prep the carrots, you put them in a pan with a tiny volume of water and a little bit of butter, but it could be olive oil, and 2 pinches of salt. See, there I have used pinches, but the pinches somehow feel right. And then you simply put it over the highest heat with the lid on for 5 minutes. And then when you open the lid, there's this wonderful moment where you just have this little silky emulsion of buttery, carroty, sweet stuff, and the carrots are perfectly cooked.
And it plays into your just add water theme later on. You don't need broth or stock there.
Yeah, you don't.
It's just the water, the sweetness of the carrot, the water, the butter.
Exactly, because the carrot and the water are both doing something magical to each other. And you don't want to lose that by throwing the water away.
So, and in these chapters and sub-chapters, I've taken to calling them, some of them will have no recipes, some will have 3, some have as many, as I didn't count, but maybe 8. And I'm thinking, I mentioned Just Add Water. So in Just Add Water sub-chapter, you find a recipe for a green salad, a tahini sauce, and a chocolate mousse. Seemingly a random collection of recipes in this one chapter, but they're all connected by how water affects them. So how do you imagine a cook, especially one who might be used to a more standard cookbook organization like ingredient or technique or region, how do you imagine them navigating the contents, as you call it?
That's a really good question. I mean, a lot of people have told me they've just taken the book and kind of read it in bed, cover to cover, as if it were a novel. And then they've gone back to certain sections. And it's funny, I mean, you must have this with your own books, that you can't quite predict which of the recipes that are going to catch someone's imagination.
Right. Yeah.
And it seems to go in phases. Like there'll be whole phases of somebody telling me, maybe it's seasonal as well, because the book first came out at the very end of August in the UK. And so many people were making this recipe called ratatouille for Richard, which is named after a friend of mine who sadly died in his 50s. And his wife, Claire, who's French, always made ratatouille, but she called it ratatouille with an extra syllable. And it's not actually ratatouille, as I say in the book. It's kind of based on the ratatouille in the Disney Pixar film, because that's what my son wanted me to make, which is really a tillon. And it's incredibly easy because you slice the vegetables with a food processor. But then because you sort of circle them round in a pan, it looks very impressive and beautiful. And you can either serve it as a vegan main course, or it's a lovely side dish to something like a roast chicken. So to start with, people kept sending me their pictures of ratatouille for Richard. So I know that one, it's a very beautiful photograph as well. I think I was very, very fortunate to work with a food photographer, Matt Russell, who's great. But then I had this whole swathe of people. The Cooking for One chapter seemed to really capture people's imagination. And then I had feedback of people having, I think that's a chapter where maybe it is a bit more like a conventional cookbook in that. So I have this concept, which again is not original to me. I got this idea from Judith Jones, the legendary cookbook editor and writer, where she had this idea of one of the things that's annoying when you're cooking for one is you have all this waste. And what do you do with the second half of something? So I had this idea, what if you bought one big whole cauliflower and ate it in 3 different ways on 3 successive nights? So you could have a cauliflower cheese souffle, which to me just seems like such a lovely treaty thing to have for one person. You could make it slightly Chinese style the next night with a sticky soy sauce, Szechuan pepper, cashew nut kind of situation and some steamed rice. And then on the third night, a cauliflower pasta based on one in the Zuni Cafe cookbook by Judy Rogers. So there are certain chapters which I think are much more like other cookbooks. And then you're right. That's a very good question. The water section, yes. Would you be making a tahini sauce, a green salad, and a chocolate mousse all at once? Well, quite often I do make those 3 things in the course of a day. What I'm hoping people will take from the book is that it will make them think, water, because I was having this thought myself. The section on water is in a chapter about seasoning. And I don't think people ever really talk about seasoning food with water. And yet so often it's this magical thing that can just sort of blur out all of the harsh edges in food and make a wonderful difference, both texturally and to the flavour. And the chocolate mousse is a case in point. There's this legendary cult 2-ingredient recipe for chocolate mousse by a French food scientist called Hervé Tisse. Mine is 4-ingredient because I just think the 2-ingredient one tastes a bit austere, and I kind of prefer it if you add some sugar and eggs.
Just in listening to you answer that question, your references are so broad. Judy Rogers from Hervé Tisse to, there's Marcella Hazan, there's Edna Lewis, there's Mark Bittman. Your facility with the cooks who've gone before, or you mentioned there was some pop culture reference you mentioned at the same time, and there's an openness. I think we've talked about before where the attribution in the recipe head notes, you're not afraid to say, Edna Lewis, I learned how to do skillet scallions from Edna Lewis, and here's my take on it. That notion that you're a cook's cook kind of thing. And we were talking about how people who love cookbooks feel like, yes, I understand this context that we're working and cooking and living in.
Oh, that's so lovely. I hoped people would feel like that. The editors sort of commented that I was attributing a lot, but I feel it's crucial to attribute. And you can never manage to give every piece of credit, because if you try to trace the origin of recipe, it almost always goes much further back.
Yeah, your lemon omelet, you say, I thought I discovered this, and then you realize you hadn't.
That was one of the few recipes in the book where I thought, I've invented this great thing to add, and then actually it's hundreds of years old. Yeah. So you can't really be fully original in the kitchen ever. But if I think of one of my favourite food writers, Nigella Lawson, and her first book, How to Eat, I loved the way that she wrote. That's a book that has no photography. It's just words. It has a few pictures of kitchen utensils. Part of why I loved it was it didn't just introduce me to her way of cooking, she was so generous in crediting others. And so it was through that book that I first found out about the food writing of Laurie Colwyn, who I'm sure lots of your listeners will love and know. I didn't know about her before I read Nigella. So I kind of hoped to send people off on these trails of discovery, finding other people. And I also just really wanted to give credit where credit's due, because it's very hard to invent something new in the kitchen.
Did you have a reader in mind when you were writing?
I suppose in a selfish way, I was sort of writing for myself, but I think I was writing for myself at different stages of life. And so there's a section on feeding kids and what to do when you have picky eaters and ways to expand their palate. And there's a recipe there called chicken stew for tired people. Well, that's not me now. Like, I'm now someone, when I first had a baby, when I was 25, would look at myself now where I love doing yoga every day. And I thought, how on earth do you have energy for that? When you just have really, really little kids, I remember feeling just bone crushingly tired. And how do you fit cooking in when you're so tired that you just really want someone to bring you a bowl of hot food, but you realize it's got to be you and you've got to feed the children as well. And so that chapter was really myself sort of 15, 20 years ago. And then other sections, the thing that really pulled me through after my ex-husband left was friends. And I appreciated the friends all the more because of the strangeness of the pandemic and the fact that I could only really socialize with people by going on long, socially distanced dog walks. And so often I was having conversations with my friends about cooking because this project was in my head. So I suppose I was writing various sections for various friends. I have a friend called Sophie, who's also a writer, and I quote her in the same section where I'm talking to John Lanchester about the fact that recipes are all incomplete. And I remember she just said to me one day, well, I just hate recipes that tell you to reduce stuff. But then I asked her what she'd cooked the day before, and she said, well, I made this sauce and it was kind of a puttanesca, and then it tasted so good because I added all of these olives and anchovies and things in, and I bubbled it away for a really long time and it got a lot smaller. And I said, Sophie, that's reducing it. She's like, no, but I don't call it that.
She calls it getting smaller.
Yes. But those conversations were kind of golden for me because I also got lots of recipe ideas that way from walking with friends and then saying, well, what's your favorite thing to eat? Or what does your mother make? Or I just love getting these little windows into the ways in which different things happen behind closed doors in other people's kitchens.
It feels like a conversation. And Kate and I were talking about how there's this unique thing where, I mean, you used the term self-help earlier, like in terms of the organization, the thematic thing, but it's a very personal book, but yet it doesn't feel too intimate. It also feels like it's talking to me, you know? I struggle to articulate this because there is so much of you in it, Bea, but it also feels like you've made room at the table or in the conversation for me, for the reader.
Well, I'm delighted. That was what I hoped to do. I wanted to welcome people in. I mean, maybe I was almost creating an imaginary friend and chatting to them because it's the pandemic and you couldn't actually have people round for dinner. So maybe I was sort of having people round for a sort of imaginary dinner. I mean, it was so wonderful when you suddenly could have people round again, and the fiesta meals that got heavily cut because I, very unusually for me, handed it in way over word length. I got very over enthusiastic and there were many, many recipes which I had tested, and it was partly just I wanted to have all of the fiestas once it was permissible suddenly to have people around for dinner again. I'm delighted that you felt included in the conversation, included at the table. That's how I wanted it to be.
What was your word count when you handed this in? I'm very curious.
It was shocking, and I'm usually really good on deadlines and word lengths, partly because a lot of what I do in addition to the books is journalism. And so usually I hand stuff in on deadline, on word length, even if it's 1,000 words, it might be 50 words here or there. This one was 50,000 words over. And this is so stupid. This is so pertinent to the subject of this podcast. I can't quite believe how stupid this is. Now I'm saying this even out loud. I'm embarrassing myself. But because all of my other books were narrative nonfiction, as you've said, most of them without recipes, I'd forgotten that recipes use up words. So I'd kind of counted the length of all of the in-between bits. And I'd sort of forgotten about the recipes, which are actually, of course, the crucial words. And And it's fine because it's actually quite nice to be in a position of paring a book down. I had that with one of my other books, Consider the Fork, which a lot of people in the States have told me is their favourite of the books I've written. Maybe that one was something more like cutting 20,000 words. And at the time, it's painful. You're thinking, how am I going to lose these words?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you look at it, you think, thank goodness those words have gone.
God, yeah.
Because there's a sort of cleanness that comes from it having gone.
Mm-hmm. What was that process of knitting together, weaving together the prose and the recipes? In some books that have a lot of essay, they're very separate, but you really do just one follows the next in a very organic way. Kate and I were just wondering about the recipe development process.
And I think the recipe development process was probably different for different chapters or different recipes. So like Teach Yourself to Cook with a Carrot, for example, to come back to that mini section. With that one, I knew I wanted to have something raw, some kind of pickled thing, although actually in the end, the carrot pickle I had, it's very, very lightly pickled. But about all the different carrot pickles I tried, that was the one that I loved, which was adapted by someone called Vicky Bogle. And I just adored it. And it was so simple. So I wanted something kind of seared, I wanted something roasted, I wanted to exemplify different knife skills. So that one, in a way, the writing and the idea and the recipes all kind of fell into place quite organically. With other ones, I'm sure you must have had this too. Some recipes come to you so quickly, almost instantly, and you test them and think, I can't believe that worked. That must have been a fluke. I better test it again. And then other recipes, I would just try and try and try. And you have a sort of shadow of an idea in your head. So, for example, in the Cut Yourself Some Slack chapter, I had an idea for the longest time that I love lemon tarts, every kind of lemon tart I've ever had, but they can be quite laborious to make. So I had an idea of, is there an easier way to make a sort of citrus tart that would be as much of a treat? And I got really hung up on this recipe by the late Australian food writer Bill Granger for a crustless lemon tart. And sometimes I would make it and it would come out perfectly. And then it was really odd. I couldn't make it work. And then I just abandoned that idea altogether and thought I'm going to make it more like an American lemon square, but I wanted it to be orange and cardamom. And that sounds like a very simple switch, but suddenly the acidity in orange, it kept coming out sickly. That recipe I did again and again and again and again. And then eventually I found a really good Claire Patak recipe for lemon squares. And I realized it needed a lot of lemon juice. And that recipe was tested with the help of, by this point, I think the lockdowns had ended a little bit, but I was getting neighbours on my street to test things for me. So I remember running up and down the street with different batches of the orange and cardamom squares. And there was one man who said, I really like it, but I think it needs a couple more pods of cardamom. And I was like, thank you so much. So that one was almost crowd tested. Other ones, I find it really hard to describe what my thought process was. I mean, I don't know. It just sort of came together. I think once I had the themes, I would then think, okay, well, I need this sort of thing to be in it.
Mm-hmm. So the themes came first.
The themes came first. I mean, I have a section, which was another of my favorites to do, about the idea of building up a repertoire of dishes. And obviously my repertoire of dishes is not going to be anyone else's repertoire necessarily, but those dishes were all pegged to very important people in my life. And so that was an enjoyable one to do because there's, for example, the ratatouille for Richard I've already mentioned. There's a tofu banh mi sandwich, which is dedicated to my sister, who thinks cooking is less important than I do. But these vegetarian sandwiches, she lives in Philadelphia. She's an amazing classicist. She translated the Odyssey and the Iliad. So that's her thing. And she always tells me I go on about food too much and it's not as important as I say it is.
We all have those people in our lives.
Yeah, but these sandwiches, every time I visit her in Philadelphia, she lives near to a Vietnamese deli, we'll get these tofu banh mi sandwiches and they've become a ritual. So that it's more than just a recipe, that recipe. It's a kind of, I don't know, it's just a bedrock of our family and it's a bedrock of our sisterly love. And so it was really important to me. Still, the ones in the deli probably taste better because they have their own formula. But getting the marinade in the tofu to work so that it would have the kind of depth of flavour I could remember, that was a really enjoyable. and satisfying process when I felt I'd cracked it.
Yeah, and that's in your repertoires and rituals. Yeah, and interestingly, you call that sandwich. You don't call it banh mi. You describe it as a banh mi, but you call it a Vietnamese Philadelphia or Philadelphia Vietnamese tofu sandwich.
Yeah, it's very much a Philadelphia thing for me because it's all about being with my nieces and my sister in Philadelphia, opening these paper packages of the lovely deli sandwiches at my sister's table.
When we're thinking about how you ended this book, you have all these stories, and you've been lacing all the head notes and your personal stories throughout the book, and then you have to figure out how to end this book. And I think a lot of cookbooks end kind of abruptly. It's like dessert chapter and then acknowledgments or resources section. And this book, you have all these aphorisms at the end. It's almost like somebody could put these up on a poster in their kitchen and think, okay, these are things I'm just going to remember just to remind myself on why I'm here and why I like doing this. How did that section come to be?
It kind of came to be from a really early stage. I kept just writing these down, almost like trying to teach myself what the book was really about. So the very first aphorism, it's much harder to remain furious with someone when they have cooked you something wonderful. This is also true when you cook for yourself. Another one, many people believe they dislike cooking when what they really dislike is washing dishes. And my kids would say I'm a hypocrite for this one, but apologizing for its shortcomings never made a meal taste better. My youngest son now tries to catch me out when I apologize, which is good. He stops me. But I do still sometimes do it, I must admit.
Well, sometimes the aphorisms we live by are the ones we need the most.
Absolutely. I have to keep coming back to it. So
exactly.
I was just kind of jotting these down as I went along. And it's partly a bit like when I said, the secret of cooking is the person who cooks. And I thought of that. And then I kept thinking, is there any example where that's not true? And I still haven't thought of one, because if you're a chef cooking in a fancy high-end kitchen, you are the person who's making it happen. If you are a parent who feels a bit like a short order cook, producing dinner day in, day out, whether you want to or not, you're the person who's making it happen. And if you're someone, as so many households are now, you're someone living alone, coming back after a long day's work and thinking, is it even worth cooking? How do I summon up the energy? You're the person. So really what I was doing with these aphorisms, and again, there were about 3 times as many as this. These were the ones that made the cut in the end. I just kept writing them and then thinking, is this really true? And it could only stay in if it continued to seem true when I kept coming back to it. But I had fun writing them.
Well, they're very fun to read, and they're like a little Easter egg at the back of the book. You, as Kate says, you're not used to finding things like that back there. But question, this is just interesting as most of our listeners, well, we have listeners all over the world, actually, but a lot of our listeners are in the U.S. and Canada. Did you always know there would be a U.S. edition of this book?
Yes, I did. The process of the proposal, it went out at the same time to Melanie Tortoroli at Norton and then Louise Haynes at Fourth Estate in the UK. So yeah, the 2 editions were done at the same time.
Great. Yeah, because they came out within a month of each other. And of course, there's the different cover, and that's a whole separate conversation about
2
British book
extremely
covers.
different covers. And I love them both, but they couldn't be more different. No, it's fascinating.
I love that the UK one has the box grater,
Yes.
and because you have that whole tribute to the box grater.
I love that too. But I've heard American books, well, I don't know, maybe you can tell me that you need to have food on the cover of an American.
Or a photograph. I have an illustrated cover of my last book, and I don't know that it did it any favors, but I love it. So
I love illustrations, and I know that's the dinner book, isn't it?
Yes.
I
And
love
Melanie at Norton, they tend to be a little bit more willing to take that risk. But the general thinking is U.S. books should have a photograph of food on the cover.
And maybe it's right. I mean, you kind of think maybe you could test it out both ways round. It would be nice to see whether American readers might be more receptive to non-photograph covers. I don't know. They must know what they're doing, mustn't they?
Yeah, Kate, remember we spoke with Matt Sartwell at Kitchen Arts and Letters.
Right.
He said, absolutely, U.S. market, you want photos of food on the cover. That's what sells. So
He would know what he's talking about. He is the guru, isn't he? I love that store.
you write towards the end of the book that you believe the golden age of home cooking is yet to come, which is a beautiful sentiment. And as someone with such deep knowledge of cookbooks past and present, we're curious what you would be excited to see going forward in cookbooks. What might cookbook authors do to help us usher in this golden age?
I think they already are helping us usher in the golden age. I mean, I really wrote this book as I've been a cookbook fan for most of my life. I think they're just the most wonderful objects. I mean, I haven't really explained the title, The Secret of Cooking, so it's partly, just it's trying to be many things at once, but it partly came about because through my work as a historian, I was aware that before there were cookbooks, there were these things called books of secrets that were really just a sort of compendium of everything from a cure to baldness to a recipe for melon jam to here is a tart that will make you very courageous to here is a cure for melancholy to here is something that will cure the passions of the heart. And it strikes me that cookbooks are still things that we go to make life better. And the remarkable thing is that unlike so many other things that are peddled at us, particularly through social media, as cure-alls, to me, a good cookbook, it doesn't cure everything, but it totally makes everyday life taste better. I feel such gratitude to the great cookbook authors. I mean, anyone from Ottolenghi to Claudia Roden to Marcella Hazan, who have put delicious food on my table and my kids' table that we never would have tasted otherwise. I do think the golden age is now, and I think we don't talk enough about the ways in which, yes, of course, there's massive trends in the opposite direction and people getting food delivered around and huge problems with diet-related ill health. But the ways in which a whole generation of young men are cooking in a way that their grandfather's generation just wouldn't have thought of doing, and they're doing it for pleasure, not just to sustenance. And that's an incredible position of luxury to have reached, even if it doesn't always feel like luxury when you're having to do it under a time pressure with not quite the right ingredients in your refrigerator.
I think that's a really nice note to end on. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us. And again, congratulations on this remarkable book.
Oh, thank you. It's been a joy to talk to you both.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. If you like the show, please leave us a review. It really does help people find the show. Any book mentioned can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thank you to our editor, Abby Circatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.